each year. Yet we have seen no evidence of stars forming, and this is a big problem. Because let's say the universe is 13 to 15 billion years old, and there are estimates of 10 to the 22 or 10 to the 24, it means 24 zeros, of number of stars. So if you do the math, assuming that there is no star destruction, which is not the case, so the number should even be bigger than this, there should be 66 or 660 billion stars formed each year. Yet we're not seeing that. All we see in space are these gaseous clouds, and they're not forming anything. But because they say stars take a long time to form, they then say that it's just going to take too long to see, yet even the physics calculations don't match up. There's no reason to expect all this gas to collapse in on itself. So there is no evidence for stars forming. Now that isn't a problem because stars could form, God could make a cyclical nature similar to the water cycle for stars forming. Just because stars form, or if stars did form, that doesn't negate the biblical worldview. But this is a major problem for the evolutionary worldview because their worldview requires this to occur, because otherwise you don't get the heavier elements. You don't get more stars forming, and then all the stars would die off after a while. And this brings us to the problem of lack of population 3 stars. A population 3 star is those young stars that just have the lightest elements in them, the first stars according to the Big Bang Theory. We can see out, I believe it's like 12.7 or something like that, or even more, even greater, maybe it's 13 point something, billion light years. So that, from the evolutionary worldview, means we can see 13 some billion years back in time. And yet we're still not seeing these young stars or young galaxies. This is a very big problem because that means they have to condense their time scale dramatically as far as how these things formed, or push back the beginning of the universe entirely. And that's some big problems. And as time goes on, we're only going to be able to see further and further back in time from the evolutionary perspective. There is some differences with that as we cover the speed of light later on.
I was going to ask if you're planning to talk about light travel and the time issue.
Mm-hmm.
Because something is 13 billion light years away. Well, that means that light originated 13 billion years ago. Therefore, the universe is at least 13 billion years old. I don't know if you're planning to talk about that.
That is going to be probably our most in-depth physics aspect discussion that we're going to have. So it's necessary for those of us that want to dig into this. So I'm sorry for those that don't like physics. But yeah, we will be covering that, Lord willing, with the next lesson when we talk about stars and all that. But for now, just know that there's no young stars and there's no forming stars according to the evolutionary model, which is a big problem. And that's what I said, it has to have formed even more rapidly, which is a big problem for that. And now we're going to talk about antimatter. I kind of wish Eric Jones was here because he's a big Star Trek fan, and that's what they have in their engines. Now, antimatter is a thing. Now, it is so sparse as to be basically negligible, meaning that there's so little of it that it might as well not be a thing as far as discussing physics. Because according to the Big Bang Theory, there should be even antimatter and matter. Now, antimatter is the same as matter, except the electron is positive, positron, and the proton is negative. So it just switches those two. And then if you have a normal matter piece and an antimatter piece and you touch them, they're going to explode. Big explosion. Now, there should be 50-50 of that, yet we have seen no real amounts of this in the universe. Excuse me. So it is a very, very big problem. Another problem is the lack of monopoles. Monopoles are magnets that just have one pole. So normally magnets have a north end and a south end, a positive and a negative. Monopoles, just one of those. They should be formed with intense heat that was at the beginning of the Big Bang Theory, yet we are finding none of these. Another problem with the Big Bang Theory model. So we're just seeing every prediction that they have made, there is no evidence to support that except for the background microwave radiation. And even with that, they were wrong as far as the temperature to tenfold wrong. They were off by tenfolds. That's what I meant to say. And another one is the flatness problem. So you can see here, this represents the expansion of the universe. If it expands too quickly, you get it just going crazy and exploding. If it expands too slowly, it's going to collapse in on itself. And the further back in time you go, the more fine-tuned this had to have been, almost as if it was designed. Yet that can't be. So according to the evolutionary mechanism, they just have to take this at face value because they have no way of controlling this, no way of regulating this. This just has to be a fancy coincidence. So it's a big problem because when you have large-scale mechanisms that are balanced with two extremes that prevent it from occurring after it reaches those extremes, there needs to be a mechanism for control. And there isn't any. And now we're going to be covering the biggest problem with the evolutionary theory, the problem of the Boltzmann brains. Has anyone heard of this problem before? So let me ask you this. Which is easier to form out of nothing? A piece of paper or a city? Which is going to be easier to form out of nothing if you could form something out of nothing? Which is going to be easier?
Presumably the piece of paper.
Smaller thing, yes. So it's always going to be more probable or easier for the smaller object to be created. So that leads you to think that it is vastly more likely that the universe was only created a few moments ago, because if you have something continue, that's less likely than if it's just a short time existing. So that means the universe was created a short time ago, and it's just a brain, your brain. And all the memories that you have were actually just made up on the spot. There is no space, only the matter that's in your brain, only the energy that's in your brain, and time is just what you perceive it. It may not even affect your brain. That sounds kind of silly, but this is a real problem. This is not a straw man argument I'm trying to set up. To show that, here are a few papers that have been published on this. This is a real statistical problem. And if you want to go down this rabbit hole, feel free to, but you're probably going to have some smoke coming out of your ears because it is very complex math that they're getting into. But this is a real problem for the Big Bang Theory. These problems have gotten to be such a big problem in general that even secular scientists for the last several decades have been trying to move away from the Big Bang Theory as a whole. The theory has become so convoluted, so complex, so unable to be proven false because it just takes everything in. A theory that both A is right and A can be wrong is no scientific theory because it cannot be proven false. And that's what the Big Bang Theory has become. And even secular scientists are realizing this. So any questions on the Big Bang and many of the problems that it has?
I don't know if you paid attention to the James Webb telescope,
Mm-hmm.
but that was, if I understand correctly, to look at the background radiation levels, they're trying to look for that, and all they saw was more stars and galaxies.
Yeah, so it wasn't the background radiation, it was trying to see the beginning of the universe. And you're right, they just saw the older stars, evolutionary speaking, the older galaxies. So they are seeing not the beginning of the Big Bang like they were expecting to, and that has caused them to squeeze all that beginning stuff, all the inflation, all the young galaxies, all the young stars, into a tighter and tighter section. Now they only have like 300-some million years. That is very, very improbable. And as time goes on, we're only going to be able to see further out, which means, according to the evolutionary theory, further back, and just make it more and more probable or difficult for them to hold that theory. Any other questions?
Are there currently any proposed catalysts or causes for the source of the inflation, or is that just up for debate?
Up for debate. Yeah, there's nothing that they agree on and nothing that has been proven by any prediction. At least none that I'm aware of. I haven't kept up with them in the last few years. Any other comments or questions? All right. So just to summarize this last lecture, we talked about energy and light and how the laws of thermodynamics show and support a supernatural beginning, and that time, God gave us all the measurements for time from a day larger, and that the Bible clearly teaches a 6,000-year-old Earth. And this is supported by many extra-biblical clocks, and look at the RATE project for some more information on that. We're going to talk a little bit more about space and matter in the next few lectures. And for the Big Bang cosmology, the only thing that it predicted was the cosmic background microwave radiation. Even in that, they were wrong as far as what they expected with it. Many other contradictory findings. So some of the resources to go over for geology and the radiometric dating and such, here's some stuff that you can look into. And for creation, cosmology, the Big Bang, and some more information on that, here's some things. All right. Can you bring up the next lecture or next PowerPoint? keep trying to merge lesson and lecture. All right. So now we're going to be talking about day 2 and day 3. In Genesis 1, starting in verse 6, and God said, let there be an expanse between the waters, to separate the waters from the waters. So God made the expanse and separated the waters beneath from the waters above, and it was so. God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, let the waters under the sky be gathered into one place, so that the dry land may appear, and it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the earth bring forth vegetation, seed-bearing plants and fruit trees, each bearing fruit with seed according to its kind, and it was so. The earth produced vegetation, seed-bearing plants according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. So now we're going to be talking about the waters, the big blue wet thing. So we're going to be focusing on the waters for day 2 on this slide. So we do not know if the waters that were on the world, on the earth, were all the way down. We don't know if there was a crust, mantle, and core. All the Bible tells us is that there was a surface to the waters, and that all that was there. There was no dry land. But there has been some research as far as the magnetic fields of the planets in our solar system, among others, and it seems their magnetic fields do align if the planet was completely made of water. This is a bit beyond me, physics speaking, but if you can look into the Earth's mysterious magnetism, Dr. Russ Humphreys goes into depth with this. And there is evidence to support that perhaps the Earth, as well as other bodies, were all made of water initially, and then God turned them into what they are now during the later days. Now, that's not for sure, but that is a possibility that does have some evidence to support it. Now, to backtrack a little bit to day 1. The waters of day 1 were most likely fresh water, as the word pure or the word empty could mean pure or void. So it is likely that they were pure, at least at that time. And then when the day 3 waters were gathered together in one place, there are 3 main possibilities with that we are aware of. 1, the ocean basins could have dropped. 2, the continents could have been lifted up. Or 3, land miraculously appeared. Now, if one of the first 2 options did occur, there would probably have been a lot of erosion, and that could have been where a lot of the salt came from in the waters. Not all because of Noah's flood, but some of it. But if it's miraculously, maybe it was created with salt in it. Because based upon our evidence of the life present just prior to Noah's flood, these echinoderms, it does indicate that the seas, the oceans, did have some salt in them at that time. Not nearly as salty as today's oceans, but still had some in them. Oh yeah, and then most likely the saltiness increased with the flood. And this is also potentially when microorganisms were created. Now, there are 2 definitions of life, or what defines life in the Bible, and that is life is in the blood or the breath of life. Based upon that, it seems a biblical definition for life is different from our modern definition, meaning that to be alive in the Bible, to be counted as life in the Bible, such as was created in the latter creation days, was something that had to have blood and something that had to have breathed, or to some extent of those. Now, there is some assumptions in those, but this could mean that all these microcellular organisms, or these single-cell organisms, microscopic organisms, were created at this time because these organisms do a number of things in the environment as a whole. They create a number of our minerals, a number of our elements in the atmosphere, and do a number of regulations as far as the Earth as a whole. So there is that potential. Now, this is by no means a certainty, but it's a possibility, one that we must be aware of when we're doing some in-depth science at this point. Now, there are a number of design features when it comes to the oceans. I'm going to actually read from this because this is actually blending a little bit too much with the background. The sheer strength of Earth's magnetic field helps to maintain liquid water. And the planet must be large enough that the gravity will keep the atmosphere and the oceans from drifting off into space. And even sand. Who here likes sand? I don't see any hands. One hand, half a hand. There's another hand. All right. Sand has a number of microorganisms in it. As you can see here, here's a few pictures of them. They do a number of important jobs when it comes to the ocean. They act as a filter, and plankton even supplies half the amount of oxygen in our atmosphere, meaning that if the plankton were all to be wiped out, we would probably be wiped out. We depend upon them for the very air that we breathe. It's not just the Amazon rainforest. And so there are a number of design features, and we'll go more in depth with them here in a bit. But first, I want to talk about ocean currents. Who knows how they were discovered by man? They were actually discovered by this guy named Matthew Fontaine Maury. In 1855, he wrote one of the first books on modern oceanography, and it's all because of Psalms 8. Whatsoever passes through the paths of the seas. He was reading that and thought, what are these paths of the seas? And so he goes out and he actually finds them. Who'd have thunk it, the Bible being right about something? And so he goes out and he finds and tracks a number of these tides. Now, we've done a lot more research into them since then, but still, he is the one that discovered it for modern man. You can see here, or the currents, I said tides, I meant currents. So he goes through and he sees a lot of these tides and how they mix and how they move things around the ocean. Very similar to the tides. If it wasn't for the daily tides and these currents, the ocean would become stagnated, meaning that, think of like a puddle, how it becomes stagnant and just nasty and just overflown and inhospitable for life. Without these movements, these stirrings of the ocean, that would be what happens to the ocean. Excuse me. And I will mention that according to the evolutionary theory, the Earth should have no water. Previously, it was thought that asteroids and meteorites brought the water, but that is now being thought as wrong based upon modern studies of asteroids and meteorites. It is a very big problem and a very big mystery from the evolutionary worldview. But from a Christian worldview, it makes perfect sense. So any questions on the waters, at least the waters of below, the waters of Earth?
Wasn't Earth fully covered in water at the start?
Yep. And so they were fully covered, and then when they were separated into one area, or gathered into one area, I should say.
But now, water's taken over again.
Not completely, not until Noah's flood, but yeah.
I'm just saying, okay, I'm talking what I learned probably in school or whatever. I don't know if we're talking, which I guess we are talking the Bible, but like these, like the sand or whatever, Florida, water is moving in over time, making the beach even smaller and smaller over time.
Oh, as far as like the ocean's rising and such?
Yes,
Yeah.
and then it's going to take over the whole, like they're saying, 100 years from now, it's going to take over the land.
Mm-hmm. We'll get into that in a later lecture when we talk about the Ice Age, because a lot of the science that goes into that also goes into what you're just talking about. But in short, there's a lot of evolutionary assumptions with that, and from a biblical perspective, it's extremely overblown. Yeah, so we don't have to worry about that from a biblical point of view. There are a number of things that we'll get into with that, but thankfully we can trust in God that He's going to make sure that as long as things continue, He's going to make sure there's a summer and a winter and the seasons and all that. So we don't have to worry about that too much.
So global warming, does it have something to do with that? That just brought global warming to it. Yeah, that's
Yep, that is depending upon a lot of evolutionary long-age theories, and we'll go into that and as far as a number of the assumptions and a number of incorrect assumptions that they make with that.
Thank you, I apologize.
Oh, no worries. Lord willing, we can get into that here in a few weeks. Any other questions?
Are you going to address the Pangea situation?
Mhm.
It's all one thing.
Yeah, when we talk about what life was like pre-flood, we'll go into that. Any other questions or comments? All right. On to the heavens. So now we're going to talk about a few models that have been connected with the Bible over the last few millennia. So many of you probably have heard of this model here where you have the firmament above, pillars, and all this other stuff. Some have said that this layer up here that had all the stars, the moon, the sun in it, maybe called David's celestial sphere, some sort of hard area, the firmament. Basically, you can even see some moonrise, moonset, some terms that are associated with this theory, because this theory was the prevalent theory a few hundred years prior to Jesus and a few, I think, 1,000 years afterwards. So this is partly due to the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament that occurred or was written about 300 to 200 BC. They took the word rakia for the Hebrew and translated it as steroma. And that is the Greek word meaning hard, transparent, or firm. In the New Testament, in the different contexts, it's translated as steadfast. So that's what the word means. But the Jews in Alexandria that were translating this translated rakia to mean steroma, because that was the common worldview of the day. And so they integrated that in the Bible, and that is why some older translations of the Bible have the word firmament used here. It's because the Latin term firmamentum replaced the Greek term steroma, all because that was the modern idea of the world at that time. And so that was integrated in the Bible and has since been proven wrong, much as many of the modern ideas that they try to integrate in the Bible will be proven wrong, I am sure, as time goes on. Now, there is a somewhat newer model that was more common in the 1900s, which I'm sure many of you know today, or are aware of as you guys grew up. So this model has the heavens of day one being the space of the universe, and the expanse of day two being the Earth's atmosphere. And this is very similar to the three-part divided Greek cosmology, where you have the first heaven, the second heaven, the third heaven. And when I have space here, it's not space what we think, this is more the firmamentum, the hard layer there. And so people think that this is the biblical cosmology, because these two things are very similar with that. Yet, the only evidence for that is when Paul references the third heaven, and that does not mean that he supported it, only that he was referencing it. He was using terms that his readers of the day, that the people he was writing to, would understand. So I just want to make that note before we go on. Are there any questions about that before I go on to discuss a little bit more about this theory, about this model? Okay. So there are a number of problems with this. While it is similar to the Greek cosmology model, it's a little bit different in the sense that it has the stars not being in the rakia, not being in what the Greek model would call the firmament, but only appearing to be so. And it also says the birds are in the rakia. And I'm going to keep using that word rakia. It's the Hebrew word for the expanse. And this was mainly to support the canopy model. I'm sure many of you have heard about this, where supposedly the waters above was the vapor canopy, and this was used to explain why people lived so long before the flood and why it didn't rain before the flood. These are two things that it was supposed to explain and two of the reasons why it was held to. We have better explanations for the first one, and the second one does have a few assumptions with it. And we will get into that assumption later on and the better explanations later on when we go over these issues. And then during the flood, it collapsed in and was identified as the windows of heaven. The main problem with this from a biblical point of view is that Psalms 148 says that the waters are still there post-flood, because it speaks about them, and that, of course, was written post-flood. So that means the waters must still be there. Not to mention a number of other scientific problems with this, and so in general, this is largely rejected today. The modern understanding we'll get into, but let's first look back at the passages itself. And so I'm going to read it with the Hebrew words replaced. And God said, actually I have to look at this one. God said, "Let here be a rakia in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the rakia, and separated the waters that were under the rakia from the waters that were above the rakia. And it was so. And God called the rakia Shemayim. And there was evening, there was morning, the second day. And again, rakia is translated either as firmament or expanse, depending on your biblical translation. And Shemayim is generally translated as heaven. Then in day 4 and 14 it says, "Let there be lights in the rakia of the Shemayim, and let them be lights in the rakia of the Shemayim. And God set them in the rakia of the Shemayim." And then day 5, Genesis 1:20, "Birds fly above the earth, all the face rakia of the Shemayim." Now, all can mean upon, above, over, but in this term, across would probably be a better translation, argued by many people that are well more versed in Hebrew than I. So that seems to indicate a nearest edge of the rakia, suggesting a relation, but not necessarily inside it. So now that we got the biblical perspective, let's look at some modern understandings of the atmosphere, space, and all this that we could be dealing with. Oh, sorry, jumped ahead, wrong slide. Let's go into the actual verse, the words here first. So rakia, again, translated as theroma in the Greek and later in Latin as the firmamentum, because of the accommodating the science of the day. It occurs 17 times in the Old Testament, 9 times in Genesis, which we went over. The rest are all in Psalms, Daniel, and Ezekiel. And that is a hard thing to do when you're trying to, or a hard thing to use when you're trying to find a definition for a word, because the Psalms is poetry. Daniel and Ezekiel, there's a lot of metaphor prophecy in there. It's very difficult to have a concrete definition of a word when it's being used in not the expected context. But in Psalms 19, it does seem to equate Shemayim with Rakia. So at the very least, we can understand that there is a significant overlap, if not a complete overlap, because of the parallelism in that verse.
John?
Yep.
Isn't Shemayim plural?
Yes, well, we'll get into that in the next slide.
Okay.
We're focusing on Rakia now. So for the Rakia, we know some things from the biblical text. It has waters above and below. The stars are in this area, and birds fly across it. The Shemayim is plural because of the im on the end of it, and there is no singular form of this word. We have to tell if it's singular or plural based upon the context, and we can't always do that. But it's written 420 times in the Old Testament and usually translated as heaven or heavens the majority of those times. There's not much else that we can use this for since there's a number of different contexts, not just the one that is used in Genesis. So we're going to be focusing mainly on the Rakia when we're trying to figure out what the waters above and the waters below are.
Maybe I'm the only one, and I apologize to everyone for asking.
No.
I guess, are we learning what the rakia is? What the heck
That's
is
our goal,
rakia?
yeah.
What is rakia?
That's what our goal is, yeah, to figure out what that is from a,
What is the definition?
well, we don't know. We're trying to figure that out. So we're trying to use how it's used in the Old Testament to figure out the meaning of that. Because it's only used a few times. It's not something that we can look at all the ways it's used to figure out its meaning, because it's only used a few times, and so we have to figure out what that meaning is.
So it was used 420 times.
Oh, that's Shemayim. That's Shemayim, meaning heaven. Yeah, sorry. So yeah, Shemayim was used 420 times, and that can mean heaven, like where God dwells, heaven of the Shemayim, where like the Rakia is, and so there's a number of different contexts with it, so that makes it hard to understand.
Figure out what it says in the Bible, rakia.
Yes, that's what we're focusing on right
We're
now.
Like, what the heck is that?
Yeah, because we don't know what the waters above are or the waters below are in this sense. We can assume the waters below are the oceans, but yeah. What?
Like, yeah, I'm sorry.
Are you fine?
I'm sorry to everyone.
No, you don't
You
need-
guys probably all understand this, and I'm like,
No, if you don't understand, I'm sure somebody else out there doesn't understand of it. Yeah, yeah. So no, you're fine. And so, yeah, we're trying to figure out what the Rakia is so that we can understand what the waters above are.
what if we, this is the way, at least, if you read where it says rakia in the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
because it does say that,
Yes.
right? Okay, what if you read that sentence, and then we all can write down what we think, put into a big I know it sounds, I sound real, I'm sorry, you guys tell me to be quiet. And yeah, you have to, like, when you say something,
Mhm.
yeah.
No, so yeah, we're trying to figure out how the Bible uses it and then compare it to what we know as far as what it was talking about to get the meaning of that. Because this is a rarely used word, and so we're trying to get the definition from the Bible itself, since it's talking about something that we should have some interaction with today to some extent, since it's talking about the creation of the world. Here, I'll go forward a little bit, and maybe I'll answer some of your questions. You come talk to me afterwards if it doesn't.
I'm sorry.
You know what it means. You're trying to show your work on how we got there.
Yes, yeah, yeah. So I have a good idea of what it means based upon my studies that I've done. I'm just trying to walk everyone through that process.
You're trying to show how they originally spoke it
Mhm.
as,
Yeah,
rather than how we take it today.
yeah. Any other comments before we move on? All right. So now to a modern understanding of the atmosphere and space and all that. Even with our modern understanding, we don't know when the atmosphere ends. You can look at these two things up here. You can tell that they're not the same. The numbers don't line up. So even today, we cannot agree on where the atmosphere ends and where space begins. So this may mean that the Rakia has no hard cutoff line either. Could mean that it does, but at least upon a modern understanding, it may not either. So all this does correlate with the universe having the edge being the waters above being expanded, and that is an assumption, but that is the best assumption based upon the physics of today, because either it has to have an edge or it doesn't, and that changes what we think of when we think of expanse. And then if it has an edge, there must be a center. So it expanded from the center, that means Earth. That means we're integrating the waters above spreading from the Earth with the red shift that we talked about with the Big Bang, meaning that the science is showing that there is some evidence to support everything expanding from a central point, the Earth. And that is what the Bible says, that the waters expanded from a central point, the Earth. And so all this is contrary to secular cosmology, though it does fit with the data which we have. So before I go into the actual waters above, any questions on how this relates to the Big Bang cosmology?
You're talking about the waters above prior to the flood?
Well, they're still there based upon Psalms 148, I want to say. So Psalms 148 references them as they are still present. So that means as of the writing of the Psalms, so around David's time or soon after, they were still present. So we know they must be there today unless something happened to them in the last few thousand years, which we have no record of. All right. So now we have some idea about the Rakia. Now, if we're looking for waters above, there should be either at low pressure or low temperature if they're out in space. And that means they're probably ice or gas. Yet, if they're at the edge of the universe, we cannot assume what those conditions would be because the edge of the universe is an unknown. And so there are probably different things going on there, so we cannot assume that. And the biblical word used there for the waters above is liquid water, mayim. The same way that we use water today, when we say water, we usually think of the water that I have here, water in a cup, water in a glass, water in a bottle. Now, it could be ice or steam, but based upon the general use of that word, it means that there's probably some liquid water up there. And water is a baryonic or normal matter, meaning that it cannot be absolute zero. It has to have some heat in it. And if it does have some heat, that means it's likely to radiate. And if it's going to radiate, and if it's at the edge of the universe, it's going to radiate inside. So we should be looking for a near uniform field of radiation from every point starting from Earth. What does that sound like? The cosmic background microwave radiation. So from a biblical model, this could be the radiation from the waters above. And remember, we're looking for something homogeneous, meaning something that's pretty much evenly balanced. Evolutionary speaking, they're looking for something that has hot and cold pockets. And remember, they were wrong on that. This is far too homogeneous for the evolutionary model, but it fits relatively well for a biblical model. So this is one thing that does support the biblical model over the evolutionary model as far as this aspect. And that basically goes over what I just said. Now, there are a number of things that we don't know about this cosmic background microwave radiation. There is a great cold spot. No one knows what that is. And it's called the great cold spot because it's a big cold spot.
I understood that.
Good, good. The second thing we don't know, the big thing, is it's called the axis of evil. I don't know why it's called that. But what's interesting is that this actually lines up with the Earth's orbit around the sun. Again, pointing to the Earth as a special place, and this could be something that you can look into to actually connect this to the Earth's rotation around the sun. But there are a lot of things that we don't know about this, and this model is very much in its infancy. And so if anybody knows anybody that's going into college or high school that has any inclination in physics, astronomy, or anything like that, this might be the place for you to go and study. Now, I know this is kind of above a lot of people's heads. I guess it's above everybody's head since it's way up there. But there's the laugh. People are listening. All right. So this is just one model based upon our modern understanding and what we have in the Bible. This is no more true than the other models necessarily. And with time, if it's proven wrong, it's going to be tossed out just like the other models were. Now, the important thing is that we do not integrate this into the Bible like the first Greek cosmology was with the firmamentum. That is one thing we want to make clear, that this is just our best understanding with the data that we have. By no means is this gospel, but it is the best understanding with the data that we have. So that means we should look into this a lot more and not discount the Bible just because someone else says something else occurred. Does that all make sense? Do you have any questions about this before I go on to a few other points?
There's lots of questions.
Okay.
Well, it makes sense,
All right.
10%.
Well,
10%.
Wonderful. Well, if you have any questions, come talk to me afterwards. The last thing, as far as waters above, is that as far as out as we can see, we actually are still seeing water. And that's just interesting to the point because the Bible says water expanded, and if water expanded through places, there should still be some water there, or at least could be. And what do you know? We're finding water. I believe it's this one here that's actually blue. And if you want to know how they get that, I would look at this website here because that's even a little bit beyond me. So if you want more information on that, just know that they're seeing things that show there's some water out there. All right, so now we're going to talk about some design features of Earth. And all those numbers are correct. That is just gibberish. Don't pay attention to that. Just pay attention to the numbers. So real quickly, because of time, we're going to go through this because the universe is fine-tuned. We talked a little bit about the tides. Too much and we drown or boil from the friction of the moon. Too little and we have stagnant seas that kill everything. Solar system is positioned just perfectly in the galaxy. Too close and we'd be overpowered by the galactic bulge, what's in the center of our galaxy. Too little and there would be virtually nothing in the night sky. We have perfect daylight, meaning that the sun doesn't oscillate, meaning that it doesn't change its intensity. Other stars that are the similar shape and size of the sun have massive bursts of radiation, far more so than our sun does, which leads to some questions, is our sun actually a star? Or is that just an evolutionary worldview assumption? Maybe it's special. The spin of the Earth, if it was spun slower, would be greater cold and greater warming effects, meaning we cook in the day and freeze at the night. And if it was faster, we'd have violent weather. Oxygen and nitrogen, those two are in just the right capacities, one for life. If it was higher, we'd all burn up. Nitrogen is what gives everything weight. And this is something else that the microorganisms do regulate in our environment. All right, we have the Earth mass being just right, the right tilt for seasons, the perfect distance from the sun, the Goldilocks effect, so that we have life here, not too hot, not too cold. And even our orbit is perfectly round. We're not perfectly round, but perfect for life with its roundness. Right size, we even have the water cycle, and overall the right construction with the ozone, magnetic field, and numerous other things. So I just wanted to end with Isaiah 45, verse 18. For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens, who is God, who formed the earth and made it, who has established it, who did not create it in vain, who formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is no other. God made the earth to be inhabited. That means that we need not fear that the earth will become inhabitable by global warming, climate change, or anything like that. We know that God put all these things in place to make it remain habitable. Oh, are you fine?
I was just going to say, I heard what they were talking about how the conditions are just right for life here on Earth. That it's something like what is it, 10 to the 50th probability, but scientists, modern scientists projecting things impossible. It's like 1 to the 30th power of making something possible. So we're like 20 magnitudes not impossible for life here exists.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it is extremely improbable, bordering impossible for everything to line up just so for life. And that sums it up perfectly. So just for time's sake, I won't go over the summary, but here are some resources for further understanding. And these at the bottom are for those that want to get really in-depth as far as scientific articles for these new theories that are out there. Thank you.